For 28 straight years, my wife went to the bank every single Friday morning and withdrew $1,200 in cash. It wasn't until after she passed away and I stumbled upon a worn notebook that I realized the horrifying truth. She had paid our eldest daughter nearly $2 million just to keep a secret that would ultimately shatter our entire family. People often say you never truly know a person until they're gone. I used to think I knew Helen better than I knew myself. We were married for 48 years, and I built my entire life around her. But I was wrong. It was a bitter October morning when we laid her to rest. Grand Rapids was blanketed in brilliant shades of amber and deep crimson, but I had never felt so utterly empty inside. Helen's casket was simple and elegant, exactly as she would have wanted. As the pastor read the eulogy, my mind drifted through decades of memories. Our very first date at the county fair, the way she laughed when I spilled juice on my shirt, the morning she cried over a tiny bird that fell from its nest. She had the softest heart of anyone I ever met. I'm 70 years old, a retired mechanical engineer. I spent my whole career building things that were meant to stand the test of time, and I assumed our marriage would do the same. I guess it did, right up until her heart stopped 3 weeks ago. The doctor said it happened fast and that she didn't suffer, but when you lose the person who makes your world complete, there's no comfort in that. After the service, people gathered to offer their condolences. Neighbors from Wealthy Street, old co-workers, friends from her book club. Our 2 daughters stood on either side of me, Natalie and Angela. They've always been as different as night and day. Angela, my 38-year-old, held my arm gently, her eyes swollen and red from crying. She had always been close to her mother, calling every Sunday and visiting twice a month. Natalie, my 48-year-old, stood with her arms crossed. Her husband was away on business, so she came alone. She wore a designer black dress, and her expression held far more irritation than grief. I tried to tell myself that everyone processes pain differently, and then I noticed it. The watch. The morning light caught the metal on Natalie's wrist, and for a second I forgot where I was. It shimmered with a sleek liquid shine. A Patek Philippe, a luxury timekeeper that costs more than most people's cars. That specific model, with its platinum casing and intricate details, runs at least $35,000. I know my watches, and I certainly knew my daughter's income. She works in commercial real estate, making around $55,000 a year. Her husband earns a decent living, but they've always lived well beyond their means. So how on earth was she wearing a piece that cost more than half her annual salary? As the crowd began to thin out, Angela excused herself to the restroom. I found myself standing near Natalie, doing everything I could to keep from staring at her wrist. It was a nice service, someone remarked nearby. I suppose, Natalie replied, her tone completely flat, though Mom would have thought it was way too much fuss. Her words stung. Helen loved bringing people together. I honestly don't get why she insisted on being buried out here, Natalie added, looking around. It's so far out from everything. But that was Mom, always making things far more complicated than they needed to be. My jaw tightened. Complicated was the last word I would ever use to describe my wife. Angela must have walked up just in time to hear her. She stepped in, her voice trembling. Natalie, that's not fair. Mom chose this spot because it's peaceful. Because Grandma and Grandpa are buried right over there. Oh, please, Natalie scoffed, inspecting her nails and adjusting the heavy band on her wrist. Let's not turn Mom into a saint. She had her secrets, just like everyone else. The air between us froze. Secrets? What was she talking about? What's that supposed to mean? Angela demanded. Nothing. I'm just saying we shouldn't romanticize the past. You know what? I don't need this from you today. Angela choked back tears. Today is about honoring Mom, not starting a fight. I stepped between them. Not here, not today. Natalie simply shrugged and walked away, the expensive piece catching the sunlight with every step. Angela watched her leave, tears spilling over. Dad, I'm so sorry. I shouldn't have. It's okay, sweetheart. I pulled her into a hug. Your mother understands. But as I held my youngest daughter, my eyes never left Natalie's retreating figure. The luxury piece, the cold demeanor, and that bitter remark about secrets. Something was terribly wrong. The rest of the day was a blur of neighbors dropping off casseroles and offering sympathetic hugs at our house on Rosewood Avenue. Angela stayed until late afternoon, but Natalie left early, claiming she had work to handle. By 11 o'clock that night, the house was dead silent. I sat in my armchair, staring at the ceiling, completely unable to sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that wrist. A $55,000 income doesn't buy a $35,000 piece. The math just didn't add up. Helen's voice echoed in my memory. Pay attention to the little things, Philip. The smallest details always tell the truth. Midnight came and went. I thought about Helen's final days, how exhausted she had seemed, how she had spent hours organizing documents and closing out old files. At the time, I thought she was just getting her affairs in order. She had always been meticulous. But what if it was something else? What if she knew something I didn't? By 12:30, I knew I wasn't going to sleep. I stood up, walked across the living room, and climbed the stairs. My footsteps carried me past decades of framed family photos until I stopped outside Helen's bedroom door. 5 years ago, when her sleep conditions worsened, we began sleeping in separate rooms so I could get a full night's rest. She moved into the guest room, always putting my comfort first. Now the door was shut, looking exactly as she had left it. I had avoided this room for 3 weeks, but tonight something pulled me inside. I turned the handle, and the door swung open without a sound. The room still smelled like her, lavender and vanilla lotion. Moonlight streamed through the lace curtains, casting soft patterns across the hardwood floor. Everything was right where she left it. Her jewelry box on the dresser, her library book on the nightstand, her reading glasses neatly folded beside it. It felt like trespassing. Even though we had shared a home for nearly half a century, stepping into her private space felt strange. Helen had turned this room into her sanctuary during those last few years, and I had always respected her privacy. Standing there at 1 in the morning, I wondered if I had respected it too much. I clicked on the small bedside lamp. Warm light bathed the faded quilt on the bed, a quilt her grandmother had stitched by hand. I didn't even know where to begin. My mind kept flashing back to Natalie's wrist and the papers Helen had so carefully organized before she died. She had been preparing for something. I started with the dresser. Top drawer, scarves and handkerchiefs. Second drawer, sweaters neatly arranged by color. In the closet, her dresses hung in pristine order. Everything was meticulous. Then I moved to the nightstand. I pulled open the single drawer. Inside, past the old receipts, extra reading glasses, and a set of rosary beads, my hand touched something solid beneath a layer of stationery. It was a simple blue notebook, the kind you can buy for a couple of bucks at any pharmacy. The edges were worn, the cover softened by years of handling. I lifted it out carefully and sat down on the edge of the bed. I flipped it open. The very first page was dated January 12th, 1996, nearly 29 years ago. Helen's neat, careful cursive filled the lines. January 12th, 1996. Friday, 9:30 a.m., $1,200. January 19th, 1996. Friday, 9:30 a.m., $1,200. January 26th, 1996. Friday, 9:30 a.m., $1,200. I turned the page. February, March, April. Page after page, year after year. Every single Friday at the exact same time for the exact same amount, $1,200. My hands began to shake. I spent 40 years as a mechanical engineer. Numbers are my language. My brain automatically started doing what it does best, calculating. 52 weeks a year for 28 years is 1,456 weeks. 1,456 multiplied by $1,200. I grabbed a pen from the nightstand and scribbled the math on the back of an old envelope. The total stared back at me, relentless and terrifying. $1,747,200. I stared at the paper, my breath catching in my throat. I cleared my throat, convinced I had made a mistake. But engineers don't make arithmetic errors. I flipped through the pages faster. 1997, 1998, 1999. The years blurred together, But the pattern never wavered once. Every Friday, $1,200, no exceptions. Not for holidays, not for illness, not for anything. How had I never noticed? But deep down, I knew the answer. I had spent my life working long hours and weekends to support our family. Helen handled everything else: the house, the bills, the girls' activities. I trusted her completely, and while I was looking the other way, this was happening. I reached the very last pages. The entries continued all the way up to 3 weeks ago, the Friday right before Helen passed away. September 29th, 2024. $1,200. Underneath that final line, written in a shaky, uncertain hand, Helen had added a single word: done. Just that. Done. No explanation, no context. I stared at the word until my vision blurred. What was done? Was she finished hiding it, or was she simply finished carrying the burden? The room suddenly felt suffocating. I looked around at her things: her favorite cardigan, her teacup, our framed wedding photo from 48 years ago. We were supposed to share everything, yet she had kept this massive shadow from me for nearly 3 decades. Nearly $1.75 million, completely gone. Where had it gone? Helen was never lavish. She bought her clothes on clearance, clipped coupons, and wore the same winter coat for 15 years. My mind raced through the possibilities. Secret debt? Our mortgage was paid off years ago. Medical bills? We had comprehensive insurance. Gambling? Helen never even bought a lottery ticket. Then a far darker thought took root. Pressure. Someone was forcing her to hand over money, week after week, year after year. But who? And why didn't she tell me? My mind flashed back to Natalie's watch, her cold demeanor, and her sharp words at the cemetery. Mom had her secrets. Did she know something? The clock on the nightstand read 2:47 a.m. I had been sitting in that room for nearly 2 hours. I stood up slowly, my knees aching, and tucked the notebook under my arm. Tomorrow morning, I was going to the bank. Helen always withdrew the cash at 9:30 a.m. on Fridays, which meant there had to be an official paper trail. Someone there had to know what was going on. I turned off the lamp and walked back to my room, lying on top of the covers and staring at the ceiling. Sleep was completely out of the question. Every time I closed my eyes, those numbers burned into my mind. $1,200. 28 years. $1,747,200. And that final word, done. By 3 in the morning, I gave up on sleep entirely, turning on the TV just to let the soft background chatter fill the silence. But I wasn't watching. All I could think about was walking into that bank and asking questions I wasn't sure I was ready to hear the answers to. Because whatever I was about to find out, one thing was absolutely certain. Our life was never going to be the same. The bank opened at 9, and I pulled into the parking lot at 8:45. I watched the sky turn from pitch black to the pale blue of an October morning. By 7, I had brewed a pot of coffee I couldn't bring myself to drink. The blue notebook sat on the kitchen table, heavy with the weight of 28 years of quiet desperation. The drive to First National Bank took 12 minutes. I'd been doing my banking there for 30 years. So had Helen, though she clearly maintained accounts I knew nothing about. I used to think having separate accounts was a healthy sign of independence. Now, it felt like a wall built to keep me out. I walked through the glass doors right as the clock struck 9. The lobby smelled of carpet cleaner and fresh paper. A young teller smiled warmly from behind the counter. "Good morning. How can I help you today? I need to speak with the manager regarding my late wife's account." Her smile faltered slightly, shifting into professional sympathy. "Of course. Let me get Mrs. Peterson for you." Linda Peterson was in her early 60s with a sensible silver bob. I'd seen her around town at community events over the years, and as far as I knew, she'd managed this branch forever. She stepped out from her back office with a practiced look of compassion. "Philip, I was so sorry to hear about Helen." "Thank you, Mrs. Peterson. I need to see all the transaction records for my wife's personal account." A flick of surprise crossed her face. "Of course. Step into my office." Her office was small and tidy, decorated with family photos. She took her seat behind the desk. "I'll need to verify a few details, but As her surviving spouse, you have full access. What specifically are you looking for? I placed the blue notebook on her desk. Weekly cash withdrawals. Every Friday for 28 years. $1,200 each time. Her fingers froze over the keyboard. You want records going back to 1996? Yes, and I need to know where that money was going. I opened the notebook, showing her line after line of Helen's handwriting. I found this last night. I had no idea any of this was happening. Mrs. Peterson scanned the pages, her eyes widening slightly. She turned back to her screen. Give me just a moment. The silence in that office was deafening. The only sound was the rhythmic click of her mouse and the hum of the heating vent. My mind kept spinning in relentless circles. $1,200 a week. 52 weeks a year, 28 years, nearly $1.8 million. All right, Mrs. Peterson said quietly, turning the monitor toward me. Helen opened this account in January of 1996. It was completely separate from your joint checking account, funded entirely by a personal inheritance from her mother's estate. Helen's mother had passed away in late 1995. I had never asked about the details of the inheritance. We had always trusted each other with finances. The initial deposit was just under $2 million, Mrs. Peterson explained, and starting in January of 1996, she scrolled down. Line after line of transactions filled the screen. Every single Friday, a withdrawal of $1,200 in cash. My stomach dropped. Cash. No checks, no electronic transfers, no paper trail following the money once it left the counter. It continued straight through to September of this year, Mrs. Peterson murmured softly. The last entry was dated September 29th, 2024, 3 weeks before Helen died. 28 years of continuous withdrawals, matching the notebook to the exact day and dollar. What's the balance now? I managed to ask. Mrs. Peterson clicked on another tab, her expression heavy. $12.83. The number hung between us like a physical weight. Nearly $2 million drained down to $12 and change. I'm so sorry, Philip. Did she ever say why she was taking out that specific amount every single week? No. She never offered an explanation, and bank policy prevents us from prying. But Helen was always so quiet, so deliberate. Mrs. Peterson leaned forward slightly. Philip, if you had no knowledge of this, is it possible someone was putting pressure on her, forcing her hand? The implication hit me like a physical blow. Someone putting pressure on Helen, demanding cash week after week. I don't know, I whispered. I don't know anything anymore. Mrs. Peterson printed out a condensed summary. 28 years of secrecy captured on 30 pages of paper. She slid the stack into a plain manila folder. If you need anything else, please call me. And Philip, if you suspect your wife was being targeted or threatened, you might want to take this to the authorities. I nodded slowly, but the words barely registered. Almost $2 million vanished into thin air. $1,200 in cash every single Friday. Who was she handing that money to? And what hold did they have over her? I drove home on autopilot, pulling into the driveway and sitting in the car for a long time. I stared at the house we had shared for nearly 50 years. For 28 of those years, every Friday morning, my wife had walked out that front door, driven to the bank, picked up a stack of bills, and then what? Where did she go? Who did she meet? Why didn't she ever say a word to me? I looked down at the folder in my lap, 30 pages confirming that my gentle, loving wife had lived a complete double life. A single question burned in my chest. Who was taking her money, and what had they done to make her pay? A few hours later, I was sitting at the kitchen table with the folder spread out before me. The blue notebook lay beside it, a silent witness to a secret that had lasted nearly 3 decades. I needed answers, and the only people who might hold a piece of the puzzle were my daughters. I called Natalie first. It rang 4 times before she picked up. Dad, is everything okay? I need you to come over to the house today. It's important. A long pause. I'm with a client right now. Can it wait? No, it can't. Another silence. Fine. I'll be there around 3. She hung up. Next, I dialed Angela. She answered on the very first ring. Dad, how are you holding up? Can you come over, sweetheart? I found something concerning regarding your mother. Oh gosh, of course, I'll be there in 20 minutes. The contrast between my two daughters couldn't have been starker. Maybe grief was making me paranoid, but I couldn't stop thinking about that $35,000 piece on Natalie's wrist. Angela arrived first, her eyes red and swollen, clutching a tissue in her hand. She gave me a long, tight hug before following me into the kitchen. I showed her the notebook and the bank statements, watching her expression shift from complete confusion to absolute horror. $1,200, she whispered, tracing a line with her finger. Every week for 28 years. $1.7 million, Angela. All of it gone. There's $12 left in the account. Where did the money go? Who was she giving it to? That's what I intend to find out. I leaned back in my chair. Did your mother ever mention anything to you? Any financial trouble? Any unusual requests? Never. Dad, I talked to Mom every single week. If something was wrong, she would have told me. I wanted to believe her, but Helen had kept this from me for 48 years. Clearly, people were capable of keeping massive secrets. The front door chimed, and Natalie walked in, still wearing her sharp designer dress and that sparkling piece on her wrist. She looked deeply annoyed. This better be quick, Dad. I had to reschedule 3 appointments for this. Sit down, Natalie, I said, my tone flat and firm. Something in my voice made her pause. She glanced at the papers spread across the table. What's going on? I told her everything. The hidden account, the weekly cash withdrawals, the $2 million that had completely vanished. I watched her face intently, looking for any slip, any reaction. I saw surprise, but it felt practiced, almost rehearsed. That's impossible, Natalie said, shaking her head. Mom wouldn't do that. Why would she take out that kind of cash? That's the question, I said, pushing the notebook toward her. Take a look. Every Friday. The exact same amount. For 28 years. Natalie flipped through a few pages, her expression tightly controlled. And you had no idea? None. What about you, Angela? Angela shook her head, tears filling her eyes. I had no clue. Natalie dropped the notebook back onto the table. Where did she even get that kind of money to begin with? An inheritance from her mother, and now it's gone. Every last cent. Natalie leaned back, and for a fraction of a second, her glance flicked down toward her wrist, toward that high-end piece. It was subtle, but I caught it. So what did the bank say? Did they have any names, any transfer records? It was all cash, I replied, watching her carefully. Handed directly to her over the counter every Friday at 9:30 a.m. Natalie raised an eyebrow. So there's no paper trail? No way to track where it went? None at all, I said softly. It just vanished. She tapped her long, manicured nails against the wooden dining table, her gold bracelets clinking with every motion. Look, Dad, I can help investigate this, Natalie offered, her tone almost too eager. I know people, bankers, financial advisors, private investigators. Somebody can track down where Mom was moving that money. Angela narrowed her eyes, setting down her coffee cup with a heavy clatter. Why would your contacts know anything about Mom's accounts? Because they deal with large cash transactions all the time, Natalie snapped, sitting up straight. I'm just trying to offer a solution here, Angela. I appreciate the thought, Natalie, I cut in, raising a hand to settle the tension. But I'm not sure there's anything left to track. The account is practically empty. The money is gone. So you're just going to let it go? Natalie pushed, leaning over the table, her eyes searching mine. Don't you want to know where it went? What if someone took advantage of Mom? What if she was being threatened? The word threatened seemed to hang suspended in the cool autumn air of the kitchen. If someone was threatening her, Angela said softly, her voice barely above a whisper, why wouldn't she come to Dad? Why keep it to herself for almost 30 years? Maybe she was trying to protect us, Natalie countered, but the explanation slipped out a little too smoothly, like a script she had rehearsed in the mirror before coming over. I stared at my eldest daughter. A cold, heavy knot of suspicion began to tighten deep in my gut. Where did you get that watch, Natalie? The question escaped my lips before I even had the chance to stop it. Natalie's left hand instantly pulled back, her fingers reflexively covering her wrist. What watch? That Patek Philippe, I said, pointing directly at the polished metal gleaming under her sleeve. The one you wore to your own mother's funeral. That piece costs upwards of $35,000. For a split second, her composure cracked. A flash of sharp anger, or maybe cold panic, crossed her face before her practiced, indifferent mask slipped right back into place. Trevor got it for me, for our anniversary. That's a remarkably generous gift, I replied, keeping my voice dead even. Yes, it was. She stood up abruptly, grabbing her designer handbag off the counter. Look, I have to get back. A client is waiting for me. But Dad, let me help. I want to know what happened to that money just as much as you do. She didn't wait for a response. She turned on her heel and hurried out the front door. Angela and I sat in silence, listening to the heavy, heavy clack of her heels on the porch, followed by the roar of her engine as she pulled away. She's lying, Angela said quietly, staring at the empty hallway. I know Trevor's business isn't doing well. There's no way he bought that for her. And she didn't want to help. She wanted to find out how much you know. Angela turned to look at me, her brown eyes filling with fresh tears. Dad? What if Natalie is mixed up in this? The thought had been hovering around the edges of my mind since the funeral, but hearing Angela put it into words made the terrifying reality crash down on me. I don't know, I admitted, my voice trembling slightly, but I promise you I'm going to find out the truth. What do we do now? We investigate this ourselves, I said firmly. Just the two of us. We don't say a word about any of this to Natalie. Where do we even start? I thought back to the quiet room upstairs, to Helen's organized desk, her files, and the small digital footprint she left behind. Your mother was a meticulous woman. She left a paper trail somewhere. We just have to dig deep enough to find it. By 9 o'clock the following morning, Angela and I were standing on the porch of a modest house on the west side of town, Helen's laptop tucked securely under my arm. Tony Romano answered the door holding a steaming mug of coffee. Tony was an old friend from my engineering days, one of those rare guys who could strip down a heavy industrial machine and rewire a computer mainframe with equal ease. After taking early retirement, he'd turned his basement into a high-tech workshop. If anyone could unlock what was hidden on Helen's drive, it was Tony. Philip, Tony said, shaking my hand with a strong, warm grip. I was so sorry to hear about Helen. Thanks, Tony. This is my daughter, Angela. Good to meet you, Angela. He stepped aside, gesturing for us to come in. You mentioned on the phone that you needed some help accessing some files. The basement was exactly as I remembered it. 3 large monitors glowing in the dim light, stacks of hard drives, neat coils of wiring, and the distinct faint smell of warm circuit boards. What are we looking at? Tony asked, pulling up an ergonomic chair and pointing toward the workbench. I set the laptop down. I need to see everything on this drive, Tony. Every document, every email, every hidden or deleted file. Tony glanced at me, noting the serious expression on my face. This is regarding Helen? Yes. All right, let's see what we've got. Tony powered up the machine while Angela and I stood right behind him. The desktop looked remarkably tidy, with neatly organized folders labeled recipes, book club, and family photos. Tony navigated through the directories with practiced ease. Your wife was very organized, Tony observed, scrolling through the file trees. Makes my job a lot easier. Are we looking for financial records? Start there, I nodded. His fingers flew across the keyboard, running system-wide diagnostic searches. Looks like she scanned a substantial amount of physical paperwork over the years, he muttered, opening a subfolder filled with dozens of PDF files. They were high-resolution scans of paper withdrawal slips from First National Bank. Every single one was made out to cash for $1,200, dated week after week, stretching back through the years. She kept a record of every single withdrawal, Angela whispered, resting a hand on my shoulder. Tony switched over to her archived email client. Most of the messages were routine, but tucked inside a subfolder labeled banking, he uncovered hundreds of automated transaction confirmations from the bank. Digital receipts confirming weekly cash pickups, dating back to January 1996. Helen hadn't just taken the money. She had obsessively tracked every dollar, creating spreadsheets, tax documentation, and account statements, saving an absolute digital mountain of proof regarding the hidden account. And then Tony hit a wall. Hold on, Tony said, his cursor hovering over an isolated restricted folder. What's this? The folder was simply titled 1996. My chest constricted. 1996, the exact year the $1,200 withdrawals had begun. Open it, I said, stepping closer to the screen. Tony double-clicked the icon. Instantly, a pop-up box slammed onto the screen, demanding a 25-character decryption key. It's heavily encrypted. Whatever is in here, she went out of her way to make sure nobody could stumble into it. Can you bypass it? Angela asked nervously. Depends on the encryption standard she used, Tony said, opening a terminal window and launching a decryption script. Lines of code began scrolling rapidly down his monitor. Give me a minute. A minute turned into 20 agonizing minutes. Tony worked in complete silence, adjusting parameters and testing security bypasses, while Angela and I stood frozen behind him. The quiet room was filled only with the hum of cooling fans and the heavy thud of my own heartbeat. Got something, Tony announced finally, leaning back in his seat. I can't decrypt the contents of the files yet, but I've bypassed the folder envelope. I can see the file names. He expanded the file list on the main display. 3 files sat inside the folder. Accident_report.pdf, letters.docx, photos_1996.zip. The words burned into my retina. An accident report, letters, photos, all from 1996. What accident? Angela asked, looking over at me with wide, bewildered eyes. Dad, do you know what this is? I had no idea. But the pieces of this painful puzzle were slowly beginning to align. Natalie was 20 years old in 1996. That was the year the weekly cash payments started. That was the year Helen began draining her inheritance, hiding the records in an encrypted vault. Tony, how long will it take to break the full encryption on those 3 files? I asked. A few hours, maybe longer, Tony admitted, looking up at me. Your wife used a very sophisticated security protocol, but I can run a brute force script overnight. Can I come back for them first thing in the morning? Yeah, come by at 8 a.m. I'll have them open for you. Angela drove me back to Rosewood Avenue. Neither of us said a word for the first 10 minutes of the trip. My mind was spinning wildly around that encrypted folder. 1996. An accident report. Letters. Dad, Angela said quietly as she pulled into my driveway, do you remember anything unusual happening back in 1996? Anything involving Natalie? I stared out the windshield, digging deep into my memory. In the summer of 1996, Natalie was 20, living at home, working a part-time job and taking classes at the local community college. But there had been a stretch during late summer when she seemed intensely anxious, withdrawn, and volatile. Helen had assured me back then that it was just typical young adult stress. I was working 60-hour weeks at the engineering firm at the time, so I had taken Helen's word for it and didn't press further. I don't know, I told Angela, my voice thick with emotion, but I'm going to find out tomorrow. That night, I sat alone at the kitchen table with the blue notebook open before me. January 12th, 1996. The very first withdrawal of $1,200. What had happened right before that date? Why had Helen locked away an official accident report? I pulled out my phone and began searching through old records. The construction company I used to contract for in 1996 had gone out of business a decade ago, but I remembered the names of the crew leaders. One name surfaced after an hour of searching: Dennis Fletcher. Dennis had been the site foreman on a major commercial build we did down by the river in '96. He was a rough, no-nonsense guy who ran his job sites with an iron fist. I managed to locate a current landline number for him and dialed it immediately. After 5 long rings, a raspy, aging voice answered. Hello? Dennis? Dennis Fletcher? This is Philip Warren. We worked together back in '96 on the Riverside project. A long, heavy silence stretched over the line. Warren, yeah, I remember you. What do you want, Philip? I need to ask you about an incident that happened on that job site back in the summer of '96. An accident. The silence on the other end became suffocatingly heavy. When Dennis spoke again, his tone was guarded, defensive, and sharp. I don't know what you're talking about, Philip. Dennis, please, I pleaded, gripping the phone tightly. My wife just passed away, and I found records, documents from that year. I need to know what happened. I can't help you with that, Dennis said abruptly. Don't call this number again. Click, the line went dead. I held the receiver in my hand, my fingers shaking violently. Dennis Fletcher knew something. I had heard the immediate, unmistakable tension in his voice the moment I brought up 1996. Tomorrow morning I would pick up those decrypted files from Tony, and then I was going to pay Dennis Fletcher a visit in person. Dennis Fletcher lived in a run-down ranch house on the outskirts of town where the lawns were overgrown and the porches sagged under years of neglect. It was the kind of place where retired tradesmen went when the world passed them by. At 4 o'clock that afternoon, I pulled up to his driveway. I hadn't waited for Tony to finish decryption. I simply couldn't sit in an empty house any longer. Dennis knew what happened, and I needed to hear it directly from him. The green paint on his front door was peeling off in large strips. I knocked hard, the sound rattling the loose glass pane in the center. After a moment, the door creaked open, revealing Dennis Fletcher. He looked far older than his 75 years, his skin weathered like tough leather, his eyes hollow with the exhaustion of a man carrying a heavy load for far too long. "Warren," he said, his voice flat, "I told you on the phone." "You hung up on me," I interrupted, stepping closer to the threshold. "But I'm not going away. We need to talk about 1996. You don't know what you're poking around in, Philip. Then tell me," I demanded. My wife withdrew nearly $2 million in cash over 28 years, starting in 1996. I found encrypted files on her computer, accident reports, letters, photos. Tell me what happened on your job site. Dennis's shoulders visibly slumped. He stood there for a long time, holding onto the doorframe as if it were the only thing keeping him upright. Finally, he stepped back into the shadows of his hallway. "Come inside, I'll tell you. But you're not going to like what you hear." The living room was dim and cluttered with old newspapers and dusty furniture. Dennis sank heavily into a worn recliner, while I sat stiffly on the edge of a faded couch, every muscle in my body wired tight. 1996, Dennis began, staring blankly at the floor. "The Riverside build. You were handling the mechanical systems, right?" "Yes," I said. "I was there 3 days a week." "I was the site foreman," Dennis said, rubbing his weathered face with a calloused hand. "Safety was my responsibility. Late that summer, we had an incident on the upper staging area, a serious structural collapse. A worker named Carlos Rodriguez was up on the scaffolding when the cross-bracing gave out. The whole frame came down. Carlos fell 20 feet onto concrete, broke both legs, shattered his hip, smashed his spine. He never walked or worked construction again. My stomach churned. I vaguely remembered hearing about a worker getting hurt back then, but on massive commercial sites, rumors traveled fast and faded faster. What does a job site injury have to do with my wife? Dennis looked up at me, his eyes filled with a terrifying weight. "Because your daughter caused it, Philip." The statement made no sense. "What? Natalie?" "She was 20 years old," Dennis explained softly. "She was dating some college kid who was working on my crew that summer. She used to sneak onto the site during lunch breaks. She wasn't supposed to be anywhere near the active structure, but she went up to the second level anyway. She was fooling around, not paying attention, and she dislodged the safety pin holding the primary support beam in place. When she bumped that beam, the entire scaffolding section folded. Carlos was standing right on top of it. I couldn't breathe. The air in the room felt entirely depleted. Natalie, witnesses saw her run off," Dennis continued, his voice shaking. "Carlos saw her face right before he fell. It wasn't deliberate, but it was total, reckless negligence. She could have faced severe criminal charges for reckless endangerment. Carlos could have sued her into oblivion. Your daughter was looking at serious prison time." "So why didn't he press charges?" I asked, my voice barely audible. Dennis closed his eyes tightly. "Because your wife bought his silence." The room seemed to tilt on its axis. "What are you talking about?" "Natalie came to my house that night completely hysterical," Dennis said, tears welling in his aged eyes, screaming that her life was over, that she was going to jail. She begged me to help her figure out a way out. I should have turned her away. I should have done the right thing. But I was stupid, and I thought I could manage the situation." "What did you do, Dennis?" "I wrote a letter," Dennis confessed. his voice dropping to an ashamed whisper. I made it look like an anonymous demand, claiming an eyewitness would go to the police with an official incident report unless Natalie's family paid up. $1,200. That was the figure I came up with. I thought a single payment would cover Carlos's immediate medical expenses, keep him quiet, and scare Natalie straight. My head was pounding frantically. You pressured my wife. I thought it was a one-time thing, Dennis insisted, his voice cracking. Just one single payment to protect the family and keep Carlos from filing a report. Natalie paid me $500 out of her own pocket for writing that initial letter. The rest of that first $1,200 went straight to Carlos. But it didn't stop there. No, I whispered, the sickening realization settling in. It didn't. Dennis's face twisted in disgust. A month later, your wife received another demand. Same hand-typed format, same threat, same amount, $1,200, and then another one the next month, every single week, like clockwork. Natalie, I breathed. She kept sending them herself, Dennis said, wiping a tear from his cheek. I didn't realize what she was doing until months later. By then, your wife had already handed over tens of thousands of dollars. When I finally confronted Natalie, she actually laughed in my face. She told me her mother had just inherited a fortune from her estate and had more money than she knew what to do with. She said $1,200 a week was nothing to her. And then she threatened me, said if I ever told a soul, she'd frame me as the sole mastermind behind the whole scheme. Why didn't you go to the police? I demanded, standing up, my hands clenched into tight fists. Because I wrote that first letter, Dennis cried out in despair. I was an accomplice. If I went to the law, I was going to prison right along with her. I had a wife, grandkids. I was a coward, Philip. I was a weak, terrified coward. I've carried this dark secret for 28 years. Every time I ran into Helen at the grocery store or the bank, I wanted to crawl into a hole and disappear forever. I stood over him, my knees shaking with a mixture of overwhelming grief and profound fury. My own daughter, I said slowly, every word cutting like glass, manipulated her own mother for 28 years. She extracted nearly $2 million from her. She left Helen to carry that terrifying weight in absolute solitude until the day she died. I'm so sorry, Philip. I'm so sorry. My wife is gone, I shouted, tears finally breaking past my control. She spent half her life in fear, protecting a monster, and you're just sorry? I know it's not enough, Dennis wept, staring at the floor. Nothing I say will ever be enough. But Helen, she was a good woman. She protected her child at the cost of her own peace. That's a burden no mother should ever have to carry. I turned toward the door, my hand trembling so badly I could barely turn the brass knob. Philip, wait! Dennis called out behind me. Carlos Rodriguez is still alive. He lives over at the Clearview Care Center now. If you want the rest of the records, if you want to see the original paper trail, go talk to him. I didn't answer. I stepped out into the crisp autumn air and climbed into my car. For a long, agonizing hour, I just sat in the driveway, staring blankly at the steering wheel, while tears streamed down my face. My eldest daughter was the source of all that torment. She had bled her own mother dry for nearly 3 decades. She had taken almost $2 million, watching Helen cut coupons and live frugally, while she spent that cash on designer clothes and luxury watches. And at Helen's funeral, she had looked me dead in the eye without a single flicker of remorse. I started the engine, my vision blurred by rage and grief. I was going to gather every piece of evidence, and I was going to make sure justice was finally served. Sleep was impossible that night. By dawn, I gave up trying, brewing a fresh pot of coffee and sitting down at Helen's desk, surrounded by her memory. This was the desk where she balanced our household accounts, where she organized our quiet, humble life, while bearing an unimaginable financial burden in secret. At 8 o'clock, the morning mail slid through the front door slot. Bills, advertisements, and one thick formal envelope bearing the crest of a prominent legal firm, Larson and Associates. I didn't recognize the name. Our family attorney for 30 years had always been Charles Newman. I stood in the entryway and tore open the heavy envelope. Inside was a formal legal notification printed on high-grade bond paper. *RE: Last will and testament of Philip Robert Warren. Please be advised that a updated last will and testament bearing your notarized signature, was formally registered with the Kent County Probate Court on July 15th, 2024. This document designates your daughter, Natalie Marie Patterson, as the sole beneficiary of your entire estate upon your passing. All real property, financial holdings, and personal assets are designated to transfer exclusively to Ms. Patterson. July 15th, just 3 months ago, while Helen was still alive, I marched into my study, pulled open the bottom drawer of the filing cabinet, and located the green folder labeled Estate Planning. Inside was my genuine official will, the one Charles Newman and I had drafted 15 years ago, explicitly dividing all assets equally between Natalie and Angela. My hands shaking with fury, I picked up the phone and dialed Charles Newman's direct line. "Charles, I need you to pull up a probate filing immediately," I demanded without greeting him. "Kent County Probate. Supposedly an updated will under my name was registered on July 15th of this year." I heard the rapid clatter of computer keys on his end. "Hold on, Philip. Let me access the county database." "Okay, I see it here. Filed by Kevin Larson's office. Philip, I didn't draft this. When did you sign an update?" "I didn't," I said, my voice cold and hard. "I never signed a new document. I've never even met Kevin Larson." The clicking keys stopped instantly. "Are you absolutely certain, Philip? Because if someone submitted an altered or fraudulent document bearing your forged signature to the court, that isn't just a civil dispute. That is criminal fraud and elder exploitation. That is a serious felony." "I know," I replied, staring at the fraudulent paper in my hand. "And the person who filed it was my daughter, Natalie." A long, heavy pause filled the line. "Bring that document to my office right now, Philip," Charles said, his voice deadly serious. "It's time we put an end to this." I hung up the phone and stared blankly at the formal document resting on the kitchen table. Just 3 months ago, while Helen was gravely ill and taking her final breath, Natalie had submitted this document to the court. The phone rang again. It was Angela. "Dad, are you okay?" Her voice came through, filled with concern. "I need you to come over right away, sweetheart," I said, trying to keep my hands from shaking. "Something's happened." "What is it? Are you all right?" "Just come over, please. I'll explain when you get here." She pulled into the driveway less than 20 minutes later. Without saying a word, I handed her the letter from the law firm. I watched her expression shift as her eyes scanned the page. Confusion at first, followed by utter disbelief, and finally a surge of raw fury. "She forged your signature." Angela's voice trembled with rage. "While Mom was in the hospital, she submitted a fake document. This is completely illegal. You never signed anything like this." "I never did," I replied, taking the document back. "I already have an appointment with Charles Newman to contest it. But think about what this means, Angela. The money in Helen's account, nearly $2 million, is completely gone. Natalie drained every last cent. She showed up at the funeral wearing a $35,000 piece, making $55,000 a year. She blew through all that cash, and now she's desperate for more. She's coming after the house and my savings." Angela sank heavily into a kitchen chair, burying her face in her hands. "The house? Your pension? Your retirement? She forged legal papers just to lay claim to everything." She looked up at me, her eyes wide with a terrifying thought. "Dad, what if she takes things even further? What if she decides waiting for nature to take its course isn't fast enough?" The chilling thought had crossed my mind, too. "I don't think she would," I started, though my voice lacked conviction. "Wouldn't she?" Angela pressed. "She manipulated her own mother for 28 straight years. She forged your signature on legal documents. How far is she willing to go?" "I'm going to be careful," I assured her, resting a hand on her shoulder. "And I'm gathering every bit of proof I can find. Every piece of evidence is being documented. We're going to stop her, Angela." I spent the entire morning in Charles Newman's office. He carefully examined the fraudulent document under a magnifying glass, analyzing every stroke. "The signature is a very sophisticated imitation," Charles admitted, setting his glass down. "It closely mirrors your natural stroke, enough that a court clerk wouldn't question it at a glance. But there are distinct inconsistencies, pressure points in the lettering that don't match your style. A forensic handwriting expert will pick them apart easily." What's our immediate move? We file a formal motion to contest the filing, Charles explained firmly. We report the document to the police and local authorities as a fraudulent filing and financial exploitation. Then we retain an expert witness to testify. He looked at me over his reading glasses, his tone softening. Philip, this is going to get exceptionally painful. You realize you're taking legal action that could result in severe criminal charges for your daughter? She brought this on herself when she targeted her own family. I understand, Charles said with a quiet nod. I just need you to be prepared. Once we launch this process, there is no turning back. Your relationship with Natalie will be shattered beyond repair. My mind drifted back to Helen, to 28 years of Friday mornings, and to that final word, written in the blue notebook. Done. I thought about an inheritance of nearly $2 million, reduced to $12 and change. My relationship with Natalie was destroyed a long time ago, I said softly. I just didn't realize it until now. Charles nodded gravely. I'll start drafting the paperwork today. I left his office around noon. Outside, the autumn sun was bright, and the air was crisp. People were walking their dogs, cars were passing by, and the world moved on as if nothing had changed. But my world was completely rewritten. I finally saw Natalie for who she truly was. She wasn't the daughter I raised. She had become a stranger driven by greed, willing to tear her own family apart for money. I knew what she had done, deception, forgery, and relentless manipulation. But I needed absolute proof of every single step, every lie she told, every document she altered, every scheme she concocted. Because when the moment came to hold her accountable, I wanted an undeniable paper trail that no legal defense could ever dismantle. I drove home and parked in the driveway. The 2-story house looked peaceful, surrounded by the gardens Helen had tended for decades, yet nothing inside felt the same. From this moment on, I was going to uncover every hidden piece of the truth, every dark secret my eldest daughter had buried. At 11:45 p.m., a notification popped up on my laptop screen. I had been sitting in the study for hours, unable to focus on anything else while waiting for Tony Romano's message. Angela had stayed with me through the evening, neither of us wanting to be alone with the heavy reality of what we were uncovering. The laptop chimed and Tony's name appeared in my inbox. Subject, files unlocked. Philip, I've bypassed the security on the drive. The files are attached. Prepare yourself. This is tough to look through. Call me if you need anything. Tony. I clicked download and watched the progress bar crawl across the screen. Angela pulled her chair closer to mine. Are you ready for this? I asked softly. I don't know, she whispered, but we have to see it. The main folder opened, displaying the 3 files Tony had identified earlier. Accident_report.pdf, letters.docx, and photos_1996.zip. I clicked on the photo archive first. The initial image expanded across the screen, depicting a construction site bathed in harsh afternoon sunlight. I recognized it instantly. The Riverside Commercial Project, summer of 1996. A section of heavy scaffolding lay collapsed in a twisted heap of metal and concrete debris. Yellow caution tape swung in the wind, and numbered evidence markers stood beside the wreckage. A timestamp in the corner read, August 23rd, 1996. That's where it happened, Angela murmured, staring at the screen. I scrolled through the rest of the images, close-ups of a snap support beam and wide shots showing the scale of the collapse. They were official, cold documentation photos taken by a site investigator after a major failure. But no photograph could capture the devastating human cost behind the metal. I closed the photo gallery and opened the official report. Riverside Construction Site Incident Report. Date, August 23, 1996. Time, 2:17 p.m. Incident, type, structural failure/scaffolding collapse. I skimmed through pages of technical specifications, load limits, and safety protocol notes until my eyes hit the witness statements section. Statement 1. Dennis Fletcher, site foreman. At approximately 2:15 p.m., I observed an unauthorized individual on the 3rd-tier platform. Female, approximately 20 years old, lacking mandatory safety gear. Before intervention was possible, the individual made contact with support beam 7C. The beam shifted, causing a structural failure of the staging area. Statement 2. Miguel Santos, crew member. I saw a young woman on the structure. She wasn't supposed to be up there. She was moving recklessly, completely oblivious to her surroundings, and knocked against the bracing. It didn't take much, but it was enough to dislodge the pin. The whole frame went down. Injured party, Carlos Rodriguez. Injuries, compound fractures to both lower limbs, lumbar spine, compression fracture, extensive trauma. Prognosis, permanent physical impairment. I leaned back into my chair, the heavy words pressing down on my chest. An innocent man's life had been derailed because of my daughter's reckless carelessness. "Dad," Angela said quietly, her voice trembling, "there's something I need to tell you. Something I should have said years ago." I turned to look at her. In the dim glow of the monitor, her face was pale. "What is it, sweetheart?" "I always had suspicions about Natalie," the words tumbled out of her. "Not about any payments. I didn't know about that. But I knew something was wrong. She was always spending money way beyond her means, buying expensive clothes, going on lavish trips, buying whatever she wanted. Her salary never added up." "Why didn't you say anything back then?" Tears gathered in Angela's eyes. "I tried talking to Mom about 5 years ago. I noticed how exhausted and stressed she constantly looked, and I asked if there were financial troubles. Mom shut the conversation down immediately. She told me everything was handled and made me promise not to worry. But when I confronted Natalie directly about where her money was coming from, she turned vicious." "She threatened you?" "She told me to keep my nose out of her business. She said if I kept asking questions, I'd regret it." Angela wiped away a tear. "I was terrified, Dad. I was scared of what she might do, scared of causing a huge rift in the family. So I stayed silent. And now Mom is gone, and I keep thinking, if I had pushed harder, maybe I could have protected her." I reached over and held her hands tightly. "Listen to me, Angela. None of this is your fault. Natalie manipulated every single one of us. She pressured your mother for nearly 3 decades. You were trying to keep peace in this family, and I understand that. But your mother made her own choices to protect Natalie from consequences. You couldn't have changed that." I squeezed her hand gently. "All we can do now is make sure the truth comes out and that justice is done. That is how we honor your mother." Angela nodded, wiping her face, though the tears kept falling. I turned back to the screen. One file remained unopened, letters.docs. It contained the written demands, the paper trail that had started this nightmare. I moved the cursor over the file, but before I could click, Angela spoke again. "There's more to this, isn't there? Beyond just the accident." "Yes," I said, checking the time on the screen. 12:28 a.m. The demands, the written pressure, all of it. "We should take a breath," Angela said, looking at my exhausted face. "You need rest, Dad." "I need to see the whole picture." "And you will," she insisted gently. "But your eyes are heavy. We can't process all of this when we're completely drained." She was right. My mind felt clouded by the sheer volume of information, the photos, the site reports, Angela's confession. "Tomorrow," I agreed quietly. "We'll go through every detail tomorrow morning. The letters, everything." Angela stood up. "I'll be back early. We'll decide our next steps together." After she left, I sat alone in the quiet study, staring at the folder on the screen. It held 28 years of secrets in digital form, photos of the incident, official reports of her negligence, and the written demands. I hadn't read through the letters yet, but I could already envision what they contained. Calculating threats designed to exploit a mother's devotion. Tomorrow, I would examine every word in those files. Tomorrow, I would piece together exactly how Natalie maintained this charade for nearly 30 years. Tomorrow, the full paper trail would be assembled. Yet as I lay in bed, sleep refused to come. My mind raced, replaying every detail, every calculated demand, and the handwriting that looked so familiar, yet felt so cold. At 1 a.m. I got up and walked back into the study. If sleep was out of reach, I was going to use every minute to gather the proof I needed. I opened the laptop and pulled up letters.docs. Dozens of written demands spanning 28 years, all supposedly sent by an anonymous party who witnessed the 1996 incident. I lined up 6 of the messages side by side on the screen, arranged chronologically: 1996, 1997, 1998, 2005, 2015, and 2024. Then I zoomed in close to analyze the handwriting. The first note, written by Dennis back in August of 1996, carried a distinct set of physical characteristics: sharp edges, heavy pressure, and deep impressions pressed into the page. The capital N in Natalie leaned noticeably to the right, and the cross on the lowercase t was short and forceful. The second note, dated April of 1997, looked virtually identical. The same jagged style, the same heavy pressure. Either Dennis wrote it before he cut ties, or someone had painstakingly copied his style stroke for stroke. By the third note, in November of 1998, subtle cracks began to show. The overall shape was similar, but the pressure was lighter. The capital N stood more upright, the angle slightly reduced. The line across the letter T grew longer, looser, and less deliberate. These were tiny variations that Helen might have missed at a casual glance, but side by side, they stood out clearly. By 2005, the shift was unmistakable. The writer was still trying to emulate that sharp style, but her natural habits were creeping through the disguise. Spacing between words grew wider, and the loop on the lowercase g rounded out. By 2015, whoever was writing those demands had largely abandoned the imitation. The handwriting barely passed as the same hand. It was clearly written by someone else. And that final note from September of 2024, the last demand Helen ever received, bore virtually no resemblance to Dennis's original writing. I leaned back in my chair and rubbed my tired eyes. Natalie had taken over writing those notes. Maybe not the first few. Dennis might have written a couple before taking his cut and running, but at some point, Natalie took the reins. She learned to forge his hand, kept the deception convincing enough for her mother, and sustained the charade for nearly 3 decades. I pulled out a legal pad and began laying out the math. From August of 1996 to September of 2024 was 28 years. 52 weeks a year added up to 1,456 weeks, 1,456 separate demands. Even if Dennis wrote the first 15, that meant Natalie personally penned over 1,400 notes. 1,400 separate demands, each asking for $1,200 in cash, sent directly to her own mother. 1,446 demands, multiplied by $1,200, equaled $1,735,200, nearly $1.75 million, extracted week after week, demand after demand, over 28 years from her own mother. My mind drifted back to Helen, the woman I was married to for 48 years, who kept this quiet burden buried inside for nearly 3 decades. When did she realize that the demands were coming from Natalie? Certainly not at first. Those early notes must have terrified her, a stranger threatening to expose her daughter and ruin her life unless money was paid. Helen handed over that cash to keep Natalie out of prison. But after a year, 5 years, a decade, at some point, Helen had to suspect. The subtle shifts in the handwriting, the empty threats that never escalated, the demand that never increased, and the relentless pattern that outlasted any typical scheme. Perhaps she confronted Natalie directly, or perhaps a mother's intuition simply recognized her own daughter's handwriting. Yet Helen kept paying, because that's what mothers do. They protect their children even when those children don't deserve it, and even when that protection costs them everything they have. I pictured Helen in her final weeks, carefully organizing her paperwork, closing out accounts, making sure every detail was set straight. That single word penned at the end of her blue notebook. Done. She knew her time was short, and maybe, in some bittersweet way, she felt a sense of release. After carrying that load for 28 years, passing away meant freedom. No more demands, no more payments, and no more protecting a child who used love as a tool. My throat tightened, tears blurring the pages in front of me. I should have seen it, I whispered to the empty room. I should have known something was terribly wrong, but I was blind, trusting, and focused on working, making a living, and trying to be a solid foundation, leaving Helen to handle the rest alone. I let her carry that weight by herself because I never imagined she was bearing something so heavy. "I'm so sorry," I said aloud. "Helen, I'm so sorry." Saying sorry changed nothing. Helen was gone. Natalie had stolen 28 years of her peace, taken nearly $2 million of her inheritance, and robbed her of the comfortable retirement she deserved. And while doing it, Natalie wore a $35,000 piece on her wrist, living a lifestyle built entirely on her mother's quiet suffering. This wasn't just theft or deception. It was a systematic pattern of emotional cruelty, spanning nearly 30 years, financial exploitation of an elder, fraud, and extortion, all wrapped in the deepest betrayal imaginable. A daughter draining her own mother for money. I shut the laptop and sat in the quiet dark. The evidence was clear. Natalie had driven the entire process from the beginning. She caused the incident, convinced Dennis to write that first letter, and then took over the reins, turning her mother's panic into a personal cash flow that lasted 28 years. In just a few hours, when the sun came up, I would take the next step. Dennis mentioned that Carlos Rodriguez was still alive and living at Clearview Care Center. I needed to see him, hear his side of things, and understand the full scope of what happened back in 1996. After that, I would lay everything out for the authorities. The notes, the financial statements, the altered will, and the statements from Dennis and Carlos. Natalie thought she had walked away clean, assuming Helen's passing meant the truth was buried forever. She was wrong. I was going to ensure she faced full legal accountability. At 2 a.m, I finally lay back down. Exhaustion took over, and I slept for 4 heavy, dreamless hours. When I woke at 6, the sun was just cresting the horizon. A cold, steady clarity had replaced the fog of grief and confusion. I showered, dressed, and brewed coffee. By 6:30 a.m., I was in my car, driving toward Clearview Care Center. Carlos Rodriguez deserved to know who had upended his life 28 years ago, and I needed to hear his account. The final piece needed to complete the paper trail against my daughter. The effort to expose the truth was just beginning. Clearview Care Center sat on the outskirts of town, a low brick building with narrow windows and a parking lot that had seen better days. I pulled in just after 7 a.m. as the early light cast long shadows across the asphalt. Inside, the lobby smelled of floor cleaner and old carpet. A nurse sat behind the desk, typing at a computer. "I'm here to see Carlos Rodriguez," I said. She glanced up over her reading glasses. "Are you family?" "No, but I need to speak with him about something that happened a long time ago. It's important." She hesitated, then picked up the desk phone, speaking briefly in Spanish. Hanging up, she pointed down the hallway. "Room 114. He says you can go on back." I found the room and knocked gently. "Come in," a voice called out. Carlos Rodriguez sat in a wheelchair by the window, the morning light catching a face marked by decades of hard physical labor. He looked to be in his early 60s, with graying hair and rough, calloused hands. "Mr. Rodriguez, my name is Philip Warren. I need to speak with you about what happened at the Riverside construction site back in 1996. Surprise registered on his face, quickly followed by a solemn look. That was a long time ago. Why bring it up now? "It's a long story," I said, pulling up the single chair in the room. "Can you tell me what you remember?" He stared out the window for a long moment. "August of 96. I was working on the 3rd level of scaffolding. We had a good crew, and I'd been in construction for 15 years. He gestured toward his wheelchair. The whole frame gave way. I fell 20 feet, broke both legs, and shattered my lower back. I spent 6 months in the hospital and another year in rehab." His tone turned bitter. "The doctors said I was lucky to keep the use of my arms. Do you know what caused the fall? They told me someone bumped a key support beam. A young woman who shouldn't have been up there, wearing no safety gear. She hit the brace, and the section folded. I never saw her face, and I never got a name. The company investigated, but she left the site immediately, and the case went cold." My chest tightened. "And how did things go for you after the injury?" "It changed everything. I was 32, with a wife and a 5-year-old daughter. Overnight, I couldn't work. Disability barely covered rent, My wife had to take 2 jobs, and medical bills piled up. My daughter grew up watching her mother work herself to the bone just to keep food on the table. He shook his head. It was hard. Really hard. I pictured 20-year-old Natalie walking away from that site without looking back, while this man's life was turned upside down. But, Carlos continued, his expression softening, about a year after it happened, things shifted. A woman started coming by to visit me. Mrs. Warren. Helen Warren. My breath caught. My wife Helen came to see you? You're her husband? His eyes widened. I had no idea. She never mentioned that. She came by once a month at first, then every few months. She'd sit right here, ask how I was doing, and how my family was holding up. She asked about my daughter and my wife's health, and every time she visited, she brought money. $500, sometimes more. Every single time, without fail. I sat in silence, trying to process what he was saying. She kept that up for years, Carlos said softly. 10, 15 years. I lost track. The last time I saw her was maybe 6 months ago. She looked tired that day, and when I asked if she was okay, she just smiled and said she was getting older. His voice cracked. That money put my daughter through college, covered medical expenses when my wife fell ill, and kept a roof over our heads. I never knew why she did it. I thought maybe she was with the builder or a charitable organization, but I never pressed her. I was just grateful. Did she ever offer an explanation? No. She just said she wanted to help, that she'd heard about the incident, and felt I deserved support. She never asked for recognition or thanks. Tears welled in Carlos's eyes. She was one of the kindest people I ever met. Tears filled my own eyes. Helen was handing over $1,200 a week to keep Natalie's secret, while quietly taking $500 a month out of her own funds to give to Carlos, trying to ease the hardship her daughter had caused. She carried both weights at once, the pressure of the demands and the burden of remorse. While protecting her daughter from public fallout, she was quietly attempting to make amends for the harm that had been done. Mr. Warren, Carlos looked at me with concern. Are you all right? Yes, I wiped my eyes. Thank you for sharing that with me. How is she doing? Could you pass along my thanks next time you see her? I always wanted to write her a proper letter. She passed away, I said quietly. Just a few weeks ago. Carlos placed a hand over his heart and crossed himself. May she rest in peace. I'm so sorry. Please know that she made a profound difference for my family. I stood up to leave, my legs feeling heavy. Thank you, Mr. Rodriguez. Mr. Warren, if you don't mind me asking, why are you looking into the incident after all these years? I looked at the man whose life had been derailed by my daughter's carelessness, who had quietly endured the consequences for 28 years, while Natalie wore luxury items purchased with taken money. Because, I said, it's time for the complete truth to come out. Outside, I sat in my car for a long time as tears fell freely. For 28 years, Helen was targeted by her own daughter's actions. Yet to a man whose life was altered by those same actions, she acted with quiet grace, managing both the financial pressure and her own conscience in an effort to make things right. She had spent through her inheritance, using significant sums over the years to support Carlos and his family. She could have kept those funds for herself or brought me into the loop so we could help together, but she chose to carry it quietly, asking for no praise. That was the woman I married, and that was the loss I was grieving. I had to ensure her efforts weren't in vain. Natalie assumed Helen's passing meant the past was buried forever, but she was mistaken. I was going to bring every false statement, every taken dollar, and every callous action to light, making sure Natalie faced the accountability she had avoided for 28 years. I drove home from Clearview Care Center with a cold, focused resolve replacing the fog of grief. The moment I walked through the door, I called Angela. I need you to come over right away, sweetheart. It's time to put an end to this. She arrived in less than 20 minutes, finding me at the kitchen table with the blue notebook open in front of me. Dad, Angela's eyes were red from crying. What happened at the care center? I met Carlos Rodriguez, I said, keeping my voice steady. Your mother was helping him all these years. She visited him regularly and provided financial support every month, trying to make amends for what happened. Angela sat down heavily. Mom never said a word. She carried all of it on her own, every bit of it, We can't let her memory be tarnished by what Natalie did. I walked into the study and brought out the armful of documents I had gathered, laying them out across the table. The blue notebook, the bank transaction summaries, printouts of the decrypted files, the site photographs, the incident report, the written demands, and the altered will, along with Dennis's contact details and my notes from speaking with Carlos. Angela stared at the pile. "This is overwhelming. It's a record of 28 years of illegal actions," I said. "Extortion, fraud, forgery, and financial exploitation. We have the paper trail right here. Now we need to let the proper authorities take over. Where do we start?" "With Charles Newman and then the police." I dialed my attorney, and he picked up on the third ring. "Charles, it's Philip Warren. I need your guidance on a critical matter." "Of course, Philip. What's going on?" I took a deep breath. My daughter Natalie extracted nearly $2 million from my late wife over 28 years, using written threats. She also submitted an altered will attempting to name herself sole beneficiary. I have a comprehensive paper trail, and I need to know the proper legal steps to take. A long silence followed on the line. "Philip, this goes beyond civil proceedings. This is a matter for law enforcement. Financial exploitation, extortion, fraud, and forgery are serious criminal offenses. We need to involve law enforcement immediately." "I understand. I plan to contact Sheriff Bradshaw next, but I wanted your counsel first." "Good. Here is how we proceed. Organize your documents chronologically and prepare a written statement outlining what you uncovered and when. First thing tomorrow, I will file a motion in probate court to contest the submitted document. However, the criminal offenses fall under the sheriff's jurisdiction. Will you meet with him?" "Directly. Once this process starts, events will move quickly. Be prepared." After hanging up with Charles, I called the sheriff's department. Tom Bradshaw had served as sheriff for 15 years, maintaining a reputation for thorough, fair work. "Sheriff Bradshaw speaking." "Sheriff, my name is Philip Warren. I need to report a series of major criminal offenses committed against my late wife and myself by my daughter. I heard papers shuffling on his end." "Mr. Warren, those are heavy allegations. Can you summarize the situation for me?" I outlined the facts as clearly as possible. The 1996 site incident, the written demands, the payments totaling over $1.7 million over 28 years, the altered will, and the physical evidence I had collected. Bradshaw listened without interruption. When I finished, he paused for a long moment. "Mr. Warren, if these records hold up, we are looking at multiple felony counts: extortion, financial exploitation, fraud, and forgery. I need to review your documentation in person. Can you come to my office tomorrow afternoon at 2? "I'll be there." "Bring every document, photo, statement, and timeline you have. I need an airtight file before taking formal action. If we move forward with charges, the evidence must be solid." "Understood. One more thing, Sheriff. Is it legal in Michigan to record a conversation if one party consents?" "Yes, Michigan is a one-party consent state. Why do you ask?" "I'm considering confronting my daughter directly with the evidence and recording her response. That could provide valuable statements," Bradshaw said cautiously. "But I want to review your documentation first. If we set up a formal interview, I want to be involved in the planning. We'll discuss it tomorrow." When I hung up, Angela was watching me intently. "Are you planning to confront Natalie here with a recorder running?" I sat across from her. "She thinks she got away with it. She assumes Helen's death closed the door on the past. We let her keep believing that until the moment we present the evidence. What if she refuses to show up?" "She won't. Her arrogance is her weakness. She submitted an altered will 3 months ago. She's not looking to run. She's looking to secure the rest of the estate." Angela crossed her arms. "When do we do this?" "Early next week, after I meet with the sheriff and he reviews the file. We'll call her Sunday evening and tell her we found documents in Helen's files regarding the estate that need to be reviewed. She won't pass up an opportunity to oversee that. Then, we lay out the paper trail, the notebook, the bank summaries, the altered document, and the handwriting analysis showing her style in those notes. We listen to how she responds while it's captured on record. We spent the rest of the afternoon organizing the file, constructing a detailed timeline on a legal pad starting from August 1996 through Helen's final payment in September 2024. Every single week was documented in Helen's careful hand. Angela made copies of every page. We placed the originals in one binder and the duplicates in another, ensuring every detail was accounted for. By 5 o'clock, the dining table looked like a prosecutor's desk. Stacks of dated records, witness notes, bank summaries tracking the funds, and the sequence of written demands showing the gradual shift in handwriting. 28 years of actions laid out clearly on paper. Angela stood and stretched. What happens now? Now, I looked at the organized binders. We wait. Tomorrow I deliver these to the sheriff. He outlines the legal steps, and early next week we set the meeting. The meeting? Yes. We invite Natalie over, present the facts, and let her own statements complete the record. Angela gave me a tight hug. I'm nervous, Dad. So am I. I held her close. But we're doing this for your mother, ensuring her quiet endurance and sacrifices aren't ignored. After Angela left, I sat alone at the table, surrounded by the documentation. Tomorrow, the file would go to law enforcement. By next week, Natalie would be facing formal legal proceedings that could carry severe consequences. Part of me still struggled to reconcile the girl I taught to ride a bike with the woman who looked at me at Helen's funeral without a trace of remorse. Yet that young girl was long gone. In her place stood someone who had financially drained her mother for 28 years, taken nearly $2 million, and submitted altered legal forms to claim the remainder of the estate. And that person was about to face the legal process. The evidence was gathered, and the next steps were set. On Sunday morning at 9 o'clock, an unexpected delivery arrived. I was standing in the kitchen, staring at a cold cup of coffee when the doorbell rang. Angela had stayed overnight in her old room upstairs, and I heard her steps on the stairs as I walked to the front door. A process server stood on the porch with a clipboard. Philip Warren? Yes. Sign here, please. I signed without thinking much of it. He handed me a thick manila envelope bearing the official seal of the Kent County Probate Court, then turned and walked back to his vehicle. I stood in the doorway, the heavy package in my hand, a cold knot forming in my stomach. Angela appeared at my side. Dad, what is that? Instead of answering, I tore open the envelope and pulled out the legal filing inside. Petition for appointment of conservator of estate. The bold text seemed to jump off the page. My hands shook as I scanned the formal language. Petitioner Natalie Marie Patterson respectfully requests the court appoint a conservator to manage the estate and financial affairs of Philip James Warren, age 70, on the grounds that the subject, due to advanced age, recent spousal loss, and declining cognitive capacity, is no longer capable of managing his own financial decisions. I read the paragraph twice before turning to Angela. She's trying to take legal control of everything, I said quietly. Angela took the papers from my hand and read through them, her face draining of color. It says the emergency hearing is scheduled for this Wednesday. That's only 3 days away. 72 hours, I said, my voice flat. She's claiming I lack the mental capacity to manage my assets. If a judge grants this petition, she gains total legal control over the house, the savings, and Helen's estate, and she can use that authority to block access to the records and stall any police investigation. Angela's eyes widened. Can she actually do that? I don't know. I pulled out my phone. But I'm calling Charles right now. Charles Newman answered on the second ring. Philip, I wasn't expecting to hear from you until tomorrow. Natalie filed an emergency petition for financial conservatorship, I told him. The hearing is set for Wednesday. A long silence followed on his end. She's moving faster than anticipated, Charles said gravely. Bring those court papers to my office immediately. I need to see exactly what claims her attorney is putting forward. We'll be there in 20 minutes. Charles's office occupied a classic brick building on Wealthy Street. He met us at the door wearing his reading glasses and led us into a conference room lined with legal volumes. Angela and I sat across from him as he reviewed Natalie's filing, his expression hardening with every page he turned. Finally, he set the papers down and looked across the table. This is an aggressive legal maneuver, Philip. If granted, a conservatorship gives Natalie complete legal control over your finances, bank accounts, and property. You wouldn't even be able to access your own funds without her approval. How can she claim this? Angela asked. My father is completely sharp. The legal burden rests on Natalie to convince the court that Philip cannot manage his affairs, Charles explained. However, her attorneys have constructed a narrative centered on his age, the recent loss of his wife, and alleged rash financial decisions, specifically framing his claims regarding the missing funds as paranoia. A surge of anger rose in my chest. Documenting stolen funds isn't paranoia. I know that, Charles said calmly. But we have to prove it to the court within 72 hours. He pulled out a yellow legal pad and began jotting down notes. Here's our strategy. First, an immediate medical evaluation. I'll schedule you with Dr. Sarah Mitchell tomorrow morning. She's a respected cognitive specialist whose assessment will carry significant weight in court. Second, we submit the paper trail detailing the financial exploitation. Establishing Natalie's clear financial motive completely undermines her credibility. Third, we present witness statements. Dennis Fletcher and Carlos Rodriguez can both substantiate the background of these events. Angela leaned forward, her voice tight with anxiety. What happens if Natalie wins? Charles' expression was deadly serious. Then Philip loses total control over his estate. Natalie gains the power to drop any legal actions against her. She could sell the house, drain the accounts dry, and walk away clean, and Philip wouldn't be able to lift a finger to stop her. The weight of those words settled over me like a heavy shroud. Helen's 28 years of quiet agony, the nearly $2 million vanished into thin air, my wife's silence, and my daughter's betrayal. If Natalie won this hearing, none of it would ever be held accountable. We can't let her win, I said, my voice cold and steady. We spent the rest of Sunday locked in a desperate race against the clock. Angela and I laid out every single piece of evidence on the dining table. The blue notebook, the bank statements, the files from Helen's laptop, the forged will, handwriting samples from 1996 and 2024, photos of the luxury piece on Natalie's wrist. Everything we had painstakingly gathered over the past week. Charles called around noon with an update. I spoke with Dennis Fletcher. He's agreed to testify. He'll be at the courthouse Wednesday morning. What about Carlos Rodriguez? I asked. I'm handling it, Charles replied. The care center staff said he's willing to sign a formal affidavit, though his health won't permit him to appear in person. I'll have it notarized and entered into the record. Good. Philip, your medical evaluation is set for 8 o'clock tomorrow morning, Charles reminded me. Don't be late. I won't be. By 6 that evening, the dining room looked like a war room. Binders filled with documentation lined the table, key pages flagged with brightly colored sticky notes. Angela had drawn a detailed timeline across a whiteboard, tracking Natalie's actions from August 1996 to September 2024. 28 years, 1,456 weeks, $1,200 every single Friday. I stood at the edge of the table, staring down at the paper trail. Helen had borne this suffocating burden in complete isolation, to protect Natalie, to shield her from prison, and to save her from the consequences of her own recklessness. Helen had paid week after week for nearly 3 decades, and now Natalie was attempting to strip away whatever dignity remained. Angela stepped up beside me, resting a hand on my arm. We're going to win this, Dad. The truth is on our side. I wanted so badly to believe her, but I knew the legal system didn't always run on absolute truth. It favored the party with the slickest presentation, the sharpest attorney, and the most convincing story. And Natalie's story was built to manipulate sympathy. A grieving widower, an aging father, and a devoted daughter stepping in out of concern for his well-being. I had the truth, but I wondered if the truth alone would be enough. At 8 o'clock, Angela went upstairs to try and get some rest. I stayed behind in the study, slowly turning through the pages of the binders. Every receipt, every demand, every photo. From a small wooden frame on my desk, Helen's face looked out at me. She was smiling, the gentle, unburdened smile she had before Natalie's actions cast a shadow over her life. Before those Friday morning trips to the bank began, before she became a prisoner in her own world. I closed the binder and looked at the calendar on the wall. Monday, medical evaluation. Tuesday, final preparations. Wednesday, the emergency hearing. 72 hours. 3 days to bring everything to light. I leaned back into my chair and closed my eyes. "I won't let her take this from us, Helen," I whispered into the quiet room. "I promise you." Outside, the cool October wind rattled the window panes. 3 days until the truth had its day. At 6:15 on Monday evening, the telephone rang. Angela and I were in the study, reviewing the results of my medical evaluation with Dr. Sarah Mitchell. I had passed every cognitive assessment with flying colors, and the formal written report would be ready Tuesday morning, well ahead of Wednesday's hearing. I glanced at the caller ID, and my stomach instantly dropped. The screen displayed a name I hadn't seen in years. Trevor Patterson, Natalie's husband, a man who hadn't called my phone in over a decade. I picked up the receiver. "Trevor?" "Philip!" His voice came through the line, raspy and trembling. "I need to talk to you right now." "What's going on, Trevor?" "I found things," he stammered, his breath heavy. "Files, written demands, and cash." "God, Philip, is Natalie involved in something criminal?" My heart began to hammer against my ribs. "Where are you?" "At our house. Natalie won't be back from her office until after 9. "Stay right there," I said. "We're on our way." 20 minutes later, we pulled into their driveway on Rosewood Avenue. Before we even reached the front porch, Trevor yanked the door open. His shirt was untucked, his hair disheveled, and his eyes bloodshot. "Get inside," he muttered nervously. The dining room table was buried under a mountain of papers and a heavy cardboard box. Trevor pointed at it with a shaking hand. "I came home early from a business trip to Chicago because my flight got canceled. I was looking through Natalie's home office for some tax papers and noticed the bottom filing cabinet had a heavy padlocked latch. I used a crowbar to force it open." He reached into the box and pulled out a thick, legal-sized envelope stuffed with stacks of $100 bills. "There's $100,000 in cash here, hidden in a floor safe inside her closet." Angela gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. A cold chill ran down my spine. Trevor slid a second folder across the polished wood toward me. "Offshore banking records, Cayman Islands, Switzerland. Over $400,000 moved in small increments over the last 10 years. I opened the file. The statement showed a relentless, steady pattern of deposits. 5,000 here, 10,000 there, always structured just below the legal reporting thresholds. And then there's this. Trevor's voice cracked completely as he handed me a thin manila folder. Drafts. Dozens of handwritten draft demands, every single one in Natalie's handwriting. I pulled out the top sheet, a piece of lined notebook paper, covered in Natalie's sharp, distinctive cursive. "Mrs. Warren, this is a reminder that your payment is due this Friday. You know what happens if you stop. Don't test me." It was dated March 12th, 2015. I shuffled rapidly through the stack. Page after page, spanning multiple years, all demanding $1,200 in cash, all written in Natalie's unmistakable hand. My hands trembled so violently I almost dropped the paper. Angela hovered over my shoulder, her face drained of all color. Trevor stood across from us, his arms crossed tightly against his chest, tears brimming in his eyes. "Somebody please tell me what the hell is happening." I took a deep, steadying breath, and then I laid out the entire truth. I told him about the 1996 site incident, Natalie's recklessness, the injured worker, Dennis Fletcher's initial demand, Helen's decision to pay $1,200 every Friday for 28 years, the blue notebook, the $1.75 million, the altered will, and the emergency conservatorship filing. Trevor listened in absolute stunned silence. When I finally finished, he sank heavily into a chair, burying his face in his hands. "She lied to me," he whispered, his shoulders shaking. "Our entire marriage. She lied to me." "You really had no idea?" I asked softly. "None," he said, looking up with hollow, haunted eyes. "I thought we were doing well. I thought her real estate deals were paying off. I never imagined—" "My God, Philip, she was extracting money from her own mother? For 28 years?" "Yes," I said. "And now she's trying to gain legal control of my assets, so I can't expose what she's done." Trevor walked over to the window, staring out into the darkening street, his fists clenched tightly at his sides. "I won't protect her. Not after this. Not a chance in hell." At 8:30 p.m., I dialed Charles Newman from Trevor's kitchen. "Philip, how are preparations coming? Charles asked. We have new evidence, Charles. Massive evidence. I quickly detailed everything Trevor had uncovered in the house. Charles listened without interrupting, his sharp intake of breath clear over the line. Is Trevor willing to turn all of this over voluntarily? Yes, I said, looking over at Trevor, and he's willing to testify. Trevor gave a solemn, resolute nod. That changes everything, Charles said, his tone turning razor-sharp. The offshore statements prove financial concealment of taken funds. The handwritten drafts prove she authored the demands herself. The cash ties her directly to the physical proceeds. And Trevor's testimony completely shatters her credibility in court. I'll file an emergency motion tomorrow morning to introduce this evidence and subpoena Trevor as a primary witness. With this, her conservatorship petition will be dismissed out of hand, and she'll be facing formal criminal proceedings before the week is out. A profound wave of relief washed over me. Thank you, Charles. Don't thank me yet, Philip. We still have to go through the court process, but we are going to prevail. By 10 o'clock, Trevor had repacked the files and cash into the heavy box and handed it over to me. Take it all, he said quietly. Use every piece of it to make sure she faces full accountability for what she did to your wife. What about you, Trevor? Angela asked softly. Trevor's expression turned to stone. I'm filing for divorce tomorrow morning. I won't spend another day married to a stranger. He walked us out to the driveway. I turned to face him before getting into the car. Trevor, I'm so sorry you got dragged into this nightmare. He shook his head, a bitter smile touching his lips. You have nothing to apologize for, Philip. I'm just sorry I was too blind to see where that money was really coming from. Angela and I drove home in absolute silence, the heavy box resting securely on the back seat. I kept checking it in the rearview mirror. 28 years of deceit, 28 years of cold, calculated demands, and now the paper trail was complete. As we pulled into our driveway, Angela turned to me in the dim light of the dashboard. Dad, we're going to get justice for Mom, aren't we? I looked up at the house, Helen's house, the home she had fought so quietly and valiantly to preserve. I thought of her blue notebook, the bank summaries, the demand notes, the offshore accounts, Trevor's shattered face, Dennis's guilt, and Carlos's quiet gratitude. I thought of my gentle wife walking into that bank every Friday morning for 28 years, taking on an unimaginable weight just to protect a daughter who had turned against her. Yes, sweetheart, I said firmly, we are. Inside, I set the box on the dining table and opened it once more. The handwritten draft demands stared back at me, Natalie's cursive script sharp and clear on the page. 48 hours remained until the court hearing. The truth was no longer buried in the dark. It was about to be heard loud and clear. On Tuesday morning, I sat in Charles Newman's office as he outlined the final strategy. We need more than just the physical documents, Charles explained, tapping his pen against the legal pad. We need Natalie on record admitting to these actions in her own words. How do we manage that? I asked. Invite her over to your house tonight, Charles suggested. Tell her you want to discuss a settlement before Wednesday's hearing. Right now, she believes she holds all the cards with that conservatorship petition. Her confidence will draw her right in. Angela leaned forward. And then what? We capture the entire conversation, Charles said flatly. Michigan operates under one-party consent laws. As long as Philip is an active participant in the discussion, it is entirely legal to record her without her knowledge. If she makes incriminating statements, acknowledging the payments, making threats, or reacting when Philip reveals he knows about the offshore holdings, we'll have it all captured on audio. I hesitated. What if she refuses to say anything substantial? She won't be able to help herself, Charles countered. Natalie is driven by a need for control. She thinks she's already secured her victory, and overconfidence always leads to careless mistakes. Sheriff Tom Bradshaw, who had been standing quietly near the window, turned to face us. I will be present as a witness, concealed in an adjacent room. If she utters any threats or verbal admissions, I'll be there to document it firsthand. Concealed? I looked over at Angela, who gave me an encouraging nod. All right, I said, drawing a steady breath. Let's do it. At noon, I placed the call to Natalie. It rang 3 times before she picked up, her tone brisk and impatient. Dad, I didn't expect a call from you. We need to talk, Natalie. I kept my voice measured and calm. "About tomorrow's hearing. I want to discuss terms for a settlement." A brief silence followed on the line. "I'm listening," she said carefully. "Not over the phone. Come by the house tonight at 6. Another long pause stretched across the line as she weighed her options. "Fine," she finally agreed. "I'll be there at 6. She hung up without another word. I lowered the phone and met Angela's gaze. "She's coming." By 5 o'clock, Sheriff Bradshaw and Charles Newman had arrived at the house. Bradshaw positioned a compact digital recording device on a bookshelf in the living room, angling the sensitive microphone toward the armchair where Natalie would sit. Charles double-checked an application on my cell phone to ensure a secondary audio backup was running in my pocket. "Redundancy?" Charles noted softly, "just in case." Angela brought out fresh coffee, and we gathered in the kitchen for a final review. "Keep her talking," Charles instructed quietly. "Ask about the funds. Ask about the written demands. Let her speak freely. Don't make aggressive accusations. Just steer the conversation and let her supply the details." "What if she gets suspicious?" I asked. "She won't," Sheriff Bradshaw said confidently. "I've handled dozens of individuals like her over the years. Their arrogance becomes their blind spot." Charles and Sheriff Bradshaw stepped into the adjoining study, pulling the door almost shut, leaving only a tiny crack open. Angela headed upstairs to stay out of sight. The house fell completely still. I took a seat in the armchair opposite the sofa and waited. At 6 o'clock sharp, the doorbell chimed. I walked over and pulled the door open. Natalie stood on the porch, wearing a dark tailored suit and high heels, clutching a leather briefcase. She looked polished, professional, and entirely convinced of her own authority. "Dad," she said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. "Natalie." She walked into the living room and set her briefcase down on the coffee table, settling onto the sofa with her legs crossed, and her hands resting casually in her lap. "So," she began, a cold smile touching her lips, "you want to talk settlement?" I sat down across from her. "I've been reviewing your legal filing. I thought perhaps we could reach an understanding without dragging this through a courtroom." Natalie chuckled softly, a sound entirely devoid of warmth. "I'm glad to see you're finally being pragmatic, Dad. I know this is difficult, but it's for your own good. You simply aren't making rational decisions lately." "And what makes you say that?" I asked evenly. "You've been making wild allegations, making paranoid claims about Mom's personal finances. It's deeply concerning behavior for someone your age." I kept my expression completely neutral. $1,200 a week for 28 straight years, Natalie." Natalie's smile faltered for a fraction of a second before her composed facade clicked back into place. "Mom had her own ways of managing her money. It was her personal affair. $1.75 million, I stated firmly. "Where did that money go, Natalie?" Her eyes narrowed into sharp slits. "I have no idea what you're talking about." "The offshore accounts in the Caymans," I said quietly, watching her face closely. "The cash hidden in your closet safe, and the handwritten draft demands." Natalie stood up abruptly, her posture stiffening. "What drafts?" I remained seated, keeping my voice dead steady. "The draft demands written in your own hand, requesting cash every Friday." She glared down at me, her jaw tightly clenched. "You can't prove a single thing." "Can I?" The polished mask Natalie had worn for years finally shattered. The calm, professional demeanor vanished, revealing a raw, cold fury underneath. "Even if you think you have something," she spat, leaning down toward me, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper, "it won't matter by tomorrow afternoon. Once the judge grants that conservatorship, I'll have total legal authority over your estate. You'll be declared legally incompetent. The game is over, Dad." "Was this all just a game to you?" I asked softly. "It was about securing what's mine," she snapped bitterly. "Mom should have kept her mouth shut, but she's out of the picture now, and you're next if you try to stand in my way." The heavy threat hung in the quiet air of the room. I felt a cold, sharp clarity settle deep inside me. "You're threatening me," I said flatly. Natalie suddenly realized what she had uttered aloud, her face draining of color as she took a quick step back. "That's not what I meant." "That is exactly what you meant." She grabbed her briefcase off the table and turned toward the foyer. "I'll see you in court tomorrow morning, Dad. Enjoy your final evening of independence." She stormed out, slamming the heavy front door behind her so hard the glass panes rattled. For a moment, absolute silence filled the house. Then the study door swung open, and Sheriff Bradshaw and Charles Newman stepped out into the hallway. Bradshaw held up the digital recorder, a grim, satisfied look on his face. "We captured every single word." Charles turned to me, nodding gravely. "That statement is undeniable. She acknowledged the scheme, issued an explicit threat, and clearly stated her motive for the conservatorship petition. When we present this recording in court tomorrow, her entire case will crumble." Angela came down the stairs, her face pale as she looked between us. "Did she really say those things?" "She did," I replied quietly. "It's all on record now." Sheriff Bradshaw placed the device into a protective pouch. "I'm adding this directly to the criminal file tonight. Before the hearing even begins tomorrow, formal criminal charges will be logged with the court." Charles nodded in agreement. Combined with Trevor's testimony, the offshore records, and this audio recording, her petition will be thrown out immediately. She won't just lose her case. She'll be facing immediate legal custody, right there in the courtroom. A short while later, they departed to finalize the filings. Angela brewed a fresh pot of tea, but neither of us drank much of it. We sat in the living room, staring at the empty sofa where Natalie had sat just an hour before. "She spent 28 years doing this to Mom," Angela whispered, shaking her head, "and she didn't feel a single trace of remorse." "No," I said softly, "she didn't." At 10 o'clock, I went upstairs to my room, though sleep was out of the question. I stood by the window, looking out at the quiet, tree-lined street. Somewhere out there, Natalie was preparing for the morning ahead, fully convinced she was going to secure total control over my life. She had no idea about Trevor's discovery, no idea about the audio recording, and no idea that Sheriff Bradshaw had already finalized her criminal file. She was going to walk into that courtroom expecting a complete victory, completely unaware that the paper trail of her own making was about to catch up with her. I thought of Helen, of her 28 years of quiet endurance, of those Friday morning cash withdrawals, and of the incredible sacrifice she made out of a mother's fierce desire to protect her child. Tomorrow, that long, painful chapter would finally come to a close. Wednesday morning, 9 a.m., Kent County Probate Court. Angela, Charles Newman, and I walked through the heavy oak doors of the courtroom. The air inside smelled of old wood, paper, and floor polish. Natalie was already seated at the petitioner's table alongside her attorney, Kevin Larson. She looked immaculate, composed, and utterly confident, occasionally checking her watch. Trevor sat quietly in the back row of the gallery. When Natalie caught sight of him, a flash of annoyance crossed her face, but Trevor kept his eyes fixed straight ahead, ignoring her completely. The bailiff called the room to order as Judge Margaret Holloway took the bench. We all stood as she arranged her papers and looked down over her reading glasses. "This is the matter of the emergency petition for conservatorship filed by Natalie Marie Patterson regarding Philip James Warren," Judge Holloway announced. "Mr. Larson, you may proceed." Kevin Larson stood up, buttoning his jacket. "Your Honor, Mr. Warren is 70 years old, recently widowed, and exhibiting severe cognitive distress. He has been making erratic and unfounded allegations against his own daughter. We are seeking conservatorship to protect his financial assets and ensure his personal well-being." Judge Holloway turned her gaze toward our table. "Mr. Newman?" Charles stood up calmly, smoothing his tie. "Your Honor, my client is entirely sharp, lucid, and fully capable of managing his own affairs. This petition is not brought out of filial concern. It is a bad faith maneuver designed to silence my client and conceal a massive, multi-decade financial crime. We have comprehensive evidence to submit." The judge raised an eyebrow. "Present your evidence, Mr. Newman." Charles moved to the podium, opening a large leather briefcase and systematically laying out our exhibits on the clerk's table. Exhibit A, the personal ledger maintained by the late Helen Warren, documenting weekly $1,200 cash withdrawals, spanning 28 years. Exhibit B, certified bank records from First National Bank, confirming total cash withdrawals amounting to $1,747,200, leaving a final balance of $12.83. Exhibit C, decrypted files recovered from Mrs. Warren's personal drive, containing the original 1996 construction incident report, photographs, and initial demand letters. Exhibit D, certified account statements from offshore holdings in the Cayman Islands and Switzerland, totaling over $400,000, uncovered in the petitioner's home by her husband, Mr. Trevor Patterson. Exhibit E, $100,000 in undeclared cash recovered from the petitioner's home safe. Exhibit F, handwritten draft demands authored by the petitioner, demanding weekly cash payments from her mother. Exhibit G, an altered will filed in July of this year, while Mrs. Warren was terminally ill, fraudulently naming the petitioner sole beneficiary. Judge Holloway examined each document with meticulous care. The courtroom was dead silent, save for the crisp rustle of paper as the judge flipped through the exhibits. "Mr. Newman," Judge Holloway said, looking up, "do you have witness testimony to substantiate these records?" "We do, Your Honor. I call Mr. Trevor Patterson to the stand." Trevor stepped forward, took the oath, and sat in the witness box. Charles approached the podium. "Mr. Patterson, please state for the court how you came into possession of the offshore statements, cash, and draft demands." Trevor kept his voice steady, though his hands gripped the edge of the wooden railing. "On Monday afternoon, I returned early from a business trip and attempted to retrieve some tax papers from my wife's home office. I found a locked filing cabinet, broke the latch, and discovered the offshore statements, $100,000 in cash, and dozens of draft demands written in Natalie's hand, demanding weekly money from her mother." "And what did you do with these materials?" "I immediately turned them over to Mr. Warren and law enforcement," Trevor testified clearly. "I had no prior knowledge of my wife's actions." Natalie glared at her husband, her face turning pale as her attorney tried frantically to object. But Trevor's testimony was rock solid. Charles thanked him and turned back to the judge. "Finally, Your Honor, we submit an audio recording captured at Mr. Warren's residence on Tuesday evening, in full compliance with Michigan's one-party consent laws." Charles pressed play on a media player connected to the courtroom audio system. Natalie's voice echoed loudly through the chamber. "Once the judge grants that conservatorship, I'll have total legal authority over your estate. You'll be declared legally incompetent. The game is over, Dad. Mom should have kept her mouth shut, but she's out of the picture now, and you're next if you try to stand in my way." A heavy, suffocating silence fell over the courtroom the moment the recording stopped. Kevin Larson leapt to his feet. "Your Honor, this recording is entirely out of context." "Quiet, Mr. Larson!" Judge Holloway's voice cut through the room like a steel blade. She turned her icy gaze directly onto Natalie. "Miss Patterson, do you have any explanation for these records?" Natalie's hands trembled visibly as she stood up, her composure completely shattered. "Your Honor, that recording was manipulated. My father is lying. He's—" "Enough!" Judge Holloway struck her gavel down with a deafening crack. "I have thoroughly reviewed the paper trail before me, the offshore holdings, the altered will, the draft demands in your own hand, your husband's sworn testimony, and this audio recording in which you explicitly threaten your father to secure financial control." She glared down at Natalie with utter disdain. "The petition for conservatorship is denied with prejudice. Furthermore, Sheriff Bradshaw, you may execute the formal warrants." Sheriff Bradshaw stepped forward from the back of the courtroom, accompanied by 2 deputies. Natalie stood frozen, her face as white as a sheet of paper. "Natalie Patterson," Sheriff Bradshaw announced clearly, "you are under arrest for extortion, elder financial exploitation, fraud, forgery, and grand larceny." The deputies secured the handcuffs around her wrists, reading her rights aloud as the metal clicked shut. Natalie turned her head, looking at me with wide, disbelieving eyes. "Dad," she whimpered softly. I said nothing. I simply watched as she was escorted down the aisle and through the heavy rear doors, which swung shut behind her. 4 weeks later, in late November, Natalie entered a guilty plea to federal charges of extortion and financial fraud, receiving a 15-year sentence in a federal facility. All her seized assets, including the luxury timepieces and offshore funds, were ordered surrendered for restitution. Trevor finalized their divorce and relocated to Ohio, sending me a brief, quiet note before he left. "I am deeply sorry I didn't see the truth sooner. I sent him a brief reply, forgiving him entirely. He had been as blind to her true nature as the rest of us. On a crisp, cold November afternoon, Angela and I stood beside Helen's resting place. The cemetery was peaceful, blanketed in a layer of golden and crimson autumn leaves. I placed a bouquet of fresh roses against the headstone and knelt in the quiet grass. "I understand now, Helen," I whispered softly, resting my hand against the cool stone. "You weren't weak. You were the strongest person I ever knew. You carried that crushing weight for 28 years just to protect our family. I'm so sorry you had to bear it alone, but it's finally over. She can never hurt anyone ever again." Angela knelt beside me, placing a comforting arm over my shoulder. Mom loved us with everything she had. I nodded slowly, tears tracing quiet paths down my weathered cheeks. A week later, Angela showed me a bank statement she had received in the mail. Helen had opened a modest savings account in Angela's name decades ago, quietly depositing small amounts over the years until it had grown to $50,000. Tucked inside the passbook was a small, handwritten note from Helen. "Follow your dreams, sweetheart. All my love, Mom." Angela used those funds to open a small, cozy bakery in downtown Grand Rapids, naming it Helen's Place. I visited on opening day. The shop was bright, warm, and filled with the rich aroma of fresh coffee and baked goods. Angela worked behind the counter, greeting customers with a bright, genuine smile. She poured me a warm mug and sat down across from me at a small wooden table. "Mom would have loved this place," Angela said, her eyes shining. "She would have loved seeing you happy even more," I replied softly. That evening I sat alone in my study, looking at Helen's photo resting on the desk. Her smile was gentle and serene, exactly as I remembered her before the weight of Natalie's demands had taken hold. I thought of the blue notebook, the long bank statements, and the 28 years of quiet sacrifice. Helen had faced an impossible situation. She loved her child so intensely that she gave up her own peace, her inheritance, and her comfort to protect her, even when that love was turned against her. And standing there in the quiet house, I finally grasped the full depth of her grace. I picked up the blue notebook from the desk, my thumb running over the worn cover one last time. Then I slid it into the top drawer and pushed it closed. "Rest in peace, Helen," I whispered into the quiet room. "The complete paper trail has been laid bare. Justice has been served, and your love is what remains." I walked over to the window. The evening sky was painted in brilliant shades of amber and deep red as the sun dipped below the horizon. In the distance, the warm lights of the city glowed softly, anchoring the quiet peace of the night. Life was moving forward, the wounds were slowly healing, and Helen's quiet strength, fierce and enduring, would remain with us forever.